warriors that are born with the single purpose of conquering the galaxy, fighters who can take vicious beatings and come back even stronger while priding themselves on strength and dominance, hybrid versions with humans that use their humanity to push themselves beyond their normal limits. We're not going to be talking about them today. We're going to be talking about Saiyans versus Viltrumites, two races that have bred some of the strongest fighters across both stories. Goku and Vegeta are the catalyst for peak Saiyan battle power, and both take the advantage of the most primal cycles of being born Saiyan, even pushing themselves into literally transforming into Super Saiyans and going far beyond typical Saiyan expectation and even potential. Being Viltrumite means nearly unrivaled power by nature, living for thousands of years where you're only growing stronger with each passing day, and without any power source and just straight hands, Viltrumites can punch through planets and fight within literal stars. On average, both Saiyans and Viltrumites are incredibly similar, and they're pretty strong, which is why they're often debated between in topics like 50 Viltrumites fighting 50 Saiyans that has been driving people insane on Twitter.
You think Viltrumites beat Saiyans? This guy must be living in a fucking simulation. Jarvis, find his address!
But not only has that topic been done to death, it's honestly pretty boring and obvious. That's why I'm going to be channeling my inner low-tier god, and we're going to be getting a little bit racist. I'm going to be talking about both races and comparing which would be better between being Saiyan or being Viltrumite. Answering this question isn't just about arguing who is the strongest, but which of them actually has the better genetics. Bro, who is calling me? If you want to avoid these annoying phone calls, then you need to understand that your own information is extremely valuable. It feels like nobody is safe these days when everybody from PlayStation to Bank of America is dealing with these same breaches. It can take large corporations on average 277 days to report if your personal data has been leaked. Unless you want to give criminals a 9-month jumpstart to ruining your life, then seriously consider trying Aura. You should be protecting yourself from the worst type of cyber fraud with over $5 million in identity theft insurance. Aura will find out if your data is out there somewhere on the internet, and most of these companies just monitor your credit after the fact, and while Aura does offer that same service, their goal is to continue helping and protecting your family before the horrible breaches happen. You can press my link down below for Aura's very generous 2-week free trial, and that's 14 days to monitor your data online, which is more than enough time to find out if your data has been exposed for free. You'll find out before being notified, and that's all thanks to this video sponsor, Aura. You can't really compare the peak of Viltrumite and Saiyan ability to the average Saiyan and Viltrumite. It's just blatantly unfair. So just keep in mind that there's a pretty big difference when we're talking about the average Viltrumite and the average Saiyan compared to the very best of the best. When it comes to Viltrumite biology, and since I'm pretty much going to have to explain it anyways, you can't really understand Viltrumite biology without first understanding smart atoms. According to the official Invincible handbook, unlike your normal atom, these smart atoms remember their normal states in relation to their environment and react differently depending on the situation. Smart atoms are highly complex and difficult to control, but Viltrumites manage to master the technology. Viltrumite DNA is composed of these smart atoms which help aggressively self-repair and adapt. The entire process is pretty complicated and something that's better explained throughout its own video. But the thing with smart atoms is that they're essentially why Viltrumites have insane supernatural abilities without having a power source like chakra or ki. Saiyans don't really have much of their biology explained, unlike Viltrumites, and besides obvious differences like being born with a tail if Toriyama remembers to draw them, Saiyans and pretty much the entirety of Dragon Ball uses something called ki. The reason why Saiyan biology is pretty OP is because it makes it easier to raise and strengthen your ki, and the exact specifics about Saiyan psychology, adaptability, S cells, and transformations are things that I'm gonna talk about later. The first thing we're gonna talk about is gonna be endurance is the ability to keep fighting during harder conditions, but in this video it's going to be referring to something more like taking on damage and still being able to fight. Being completely honest, it's pretty hard to argue that Viltrumites don't immediately overtake this category even if we're talking about the higher end Saiyans. Remember, endurance is not durability. We're really just talking about how well Viltrumites or Saiyans manage to damage their body and either survive or keep on going. Even if we're just talking about comics and manga in general, Viltrumite endurance would still be pretty insane. Thragg was fighting Battle Beast with his fucking intestines pouring out of his body for days on end. I'm not even really sure I can put this on screen. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that Viltrumites casually take on damage that would ordinarily be fatal for Saiyans, and they still keep fighting. Sometimes Viltrumites don't even stop and recover, and they just keep on going and going and going. Just to put this in perspective, let's take for example Gohan in Dragon Ball Z after saving Vegeta and getting his arm broken by this ki blast. There's many reasons why Gohan is nowhere near full power and completely mentally nerfed, but losing an arm would never be this detrimental if Gohan was Viltrumite. There's really nothing in Dragon Ball that compares to Viltrumite endurance, and maybe you could try scaling off of Yamcha getting a hole torn straight through his chest, but even in Super, when we see Goku damaged in pretty similar ways, he can't keep fighting. The amount of endurance that a Saiyan has is extremely impressive, and there's a very good reason why people say that Goku with no limbs, beaten up after battle, hasn't slept in a week, COVID-19, would still foderize your favorite verse in the Big Three. What you gotta understand is that Viltrumites are just that more crazy, and it's really hard for me to imagine Vegeta still fighting with his guts hanging out of his body like Thragg or Mark. Being totally honest, there's really no way to know exactly how strong the average Saiyan or Viltrumite endurance would be, and neither of them really have any statements or showings unless you think that beginning a series Mark or Raditz scale to the average Saiyan and Viltrumite, but even then it's pretty hard for me to imagine a Saiyan surviving an attack that brutal. Having a healing factor is just as important when we're talking about survivability. Recovery in general is pretty important, even if it's not necessarily repairing your own body with some type of technique. Neither Viltrumites or Saiyans really seem to have any race-specific healing ability like Adam, Eve, or Dende and the rest of the Namekians. Saiyans and Viltrumites have passive healing factors and their bodies repair over time just like humans, but it's obviously much faster. Goku, after his original fight with Vegeta during the Saiyan saga, was damaged pretty badly and literally had his entire body squeezed and beaten up by King Kong, and that was after spamming the Kaioken, which arguably strained his body even worse than Vegeta. Even after being airlifted to the hospital for some time, recovery was still about 4 months. Maybe you could argue that Goku heals from being stabbed by Beerus in Super Saiyan God, but none of that is really elaborated on. Moreover, this was never really confirmed to be some property of being born Saiyan or some technique. You should know that Goku could use his ki to repair his body, but not in any way that's because of his race. Again, I might be totally wrong, but even if you assume that this was for some reason because he was Saiyan, it still wouldn't compare to Viltrumites. Viltrumites have survived and recovered from some of the most monstrous damage I've ever seen, and it's fair to question the full extent of their healing capability because we'd honestly have no idea. By the end of the series, more than half of Nolan's entire body is destroyed, and he implies that he could have recovered from this damage if his heart hadn't been damaged. Unless their entire head is crushed or their heart is destroyed, Viltrumites can probably recover from almost anything. Saiyans can recover from even devastating damage like Goku in the Saiyan saga, but even with the help of modern medicine, that still took about 4 months of recovery. Smart atoms are just too overpowered when it comes to endurance and healing factor, and literally being stated to be near immortality. One pretty major factor of survivability is definitely lifespan, and one is clearly superior, but I'm going to talk about both of them anyways. According to Vegeta, Saiyans remain in their physical prime for about 80 years, and I'd argue maybe different Saiyans leave their primes at different points, and considering Paragus was decently old and still had a power level of 4200 in the Broly movie, that is probably correct. This isn't that impressive in modern Dragon Ball, but 4200 is actually fairly high considering Nappa, who's around mid-class, had a resting power level of 4000. The Saiyan race does have pretty good longevity, it's just nothing compared to Viltrumites. Besides Mark, almost every Viltrumite on screen is older than 1000 years old and still growing stronger. Robert Kirkman, who's the creator of Invincible, blatantly mentioned that Viltrumites rapidly increase in strength with age, but I'm going to talk more about that later. For overall longevity, it's going to go to the Viltrumites. The next category is going to be strength. Both races grow in power through pushing their limits like true psychopaths, but one is blatantly superior. Firstly, there's two major ways to grow in power for both Viltrumites and Saiyans. I'm gonna start first by talking about the mid-combat training gains and how strong each of them grow during combat itself. Determining better strength gains could be done by measuring how much stronger Viltrumites and Saiyans become from training and pushing their limits. Both can push their bodies into reaching something similar to real-world hypertrophy. Both reach failure in tough battles and even harder training, but come back even stronger. Viltrumites and Saiyans get stronger from fighting, but there's a slight difference. Smart atoms adapt under pressure and even being set to produce greater and greater force until almost any task is performed. I've already explained how smart atoms don't just repair, but also adapt when the Viltrumite body begins reaching its limit. This makes them stronger during combat and fighting stronger and stronger opponents. But unfortunately for Viltrumites, Saiyans also continue to grow in power during combat, but on levels that make Viltrumite strength gains really seem like nothing. One statement from the Dragon Dragon Ball Z Dragon Book explains that Saiyan power grows in proportion to the strength of their opponents. Pretty much it just sounds like exactly what Smart Atoms do for Viltrumites when it comes to adapting under pressure. Viltrumites only really seem to grow in power significantly after combat when their bodies are fully destroyed, unlike Saiyans who can literally grow hundreds or even millions of times stronger if you really want to highball strength gains even before being beaten down. I'm gonna quickly go over some examples. Vegeta says that Saiyans grow stronger the more they battle to the Doria on Namek in chapter 63. Vegeta also says in Dragon Ball Super episode 39 that powering up during battle is the Saiyan specialty. Vegeta also says in the manga version of Dragon Ball Super in chapter 74 that he's growing more powerful throughout his battle with Granola, and even explicitly saying that he's getting stronger than he was minutes before. And even if you wanted to play skeptic and pretend like this wouldn't apply to the most primal type of Saiyan, Bardock himself says that Saiyans grow and evolve every time they push their limits. Akira Toriyama blatantly said that they rapidly increase in strength as they fight stronger and stronger opponents, so the longer they fought, the more the gap would shrink. In the more extreme cases of Viltrumites and Saiyans having near-death experiences from combat and recovering, they also get stronger, but just like comparing the training and combat gains mid-combat, Saiyans outclass the Viltrumites when it comes to what happens after. In Dragon Ball, these are called a Zenkai boost. These are power-ups that pretty much anybody with Saiyan blood could receive after having a near-death experience and recovering from battle, and Viltrumites also get stronger the same way, but once you deep dive into Zenkais, you'll quickly realize why this isn't even comparable. Daizenshuu 4 calls this an unbelievable power-up, and Daizenshuu 4 honestly isn't lying. They also say that the stronger the opponent, the stronger they become, just like the mid-combat strength gains. Just from one Zenkai boost Vegeta receives after nearly dying on Earth after his first ever battle with Goku, Vegeta's power level jumps from barely 18,000 to 24,000 without any training. Numbers aside, because this video isn't comparing who's stronger, Vegeta grew 33% from just receiving one of these Zenkai boosts. Then later Vegeta goes from 30,000 to, I'm not even joking, Vegeta's power level goes to 250,000 just from one full Zenkai. If you were to do the math on this one again, that means Vegeta grew 733% stronger just because he's a Saiyan. If you haven't caught on already, Zenkais seem to be exponential, and the stronger the Saiyan, the stronger the boost. That's unlike anything we've ever seen from Viltrumites, and some Saiyans like Goku and Vegeta on Namek can literally farm these Zenkais on purpose by reaching the verge of death and recovering. If you thought Vegeta was crazy, wait until you hear Goku, right? Goku first arrives on Namek with a power level in base at 90,000 that quickly turns to fucking 3 million after getting his ass beat and recovering. Goku became 3,000% or 33 times stronger without any training and just having Saiyan recovering genetics. Viltrumites and Saiyans get stronger with age, but this is something that's way more notable with Viltrumites. Goku in the very first chapter of Dragon Ball, and in the very first chapter we really even see him, Goku is already taking bullets from Bulma's handgun without any special training or even really pushing himself whatsoever. Viltrumites definitely do grow stronger naturally as they approach their prime, but the idea around Viltrumites not needing training or needing to stay in shape is just completely untrue. Robert Kirkman himself said that Viltrumites do get stronger with age, it just depends on if they're keeping in shape and exercising. Kirkman also said that eventually they reach their limit and that Conquest was probably even losing strength because of his age, so despite them living for thousands of years, even Viltrumites can't just keep growing in power forever and definitely need training. The next category is gonna be their Viltrumites and Saiyans, despite being so feared and strong and seemingly unbeatable, they definitely have their weaknesses that even the strongest are completely powerless against. Viltrumites can be easily thrown off balance and completely incapacitated by this certain high-frequency sound attack. This attack has already been weaponized against them before and seems to be extremely effective. This inner ear sensitivity that the Viltrumites have isn't only targeted through sound either, and Mark constantly slams his fists into different Viltrumites' heads. It's pretty much just whatever Mark does whenever he fights a Viltrumite, he just whips out the same move and just slams their ears together. And the reason why this incredibly niche and weird weakness even exists is because Viltrumites fly because of an equilibrium that's achieved through an incredibly complex process in the inner ear. High frequency sound and seemingly damage to the inner ear disconnects the body from the mind. The main weakness of a Saiyan is definitely more figurative and isn't some type of weapon like high frequency sound. This is more of a psychological or I guess instinctual weakness you could say, but it's just as exploitable against the wrong opponent. Saiyans live for combat, but it's more than you would probably think. The more intense the battle, the happier they feel, even to the point where it's stated in the Daizenshu that Goku and Vegeta are smiling right here completely unintentionally, and that's the goal of their lives. Finding stronger and stronger opponents brings them greater dopamine and euphoria, and that's why very often they'll honestly make terrible decisions just because that's Saiyan psychology. There's also the Saiyan's weakness of seemingly losing balance and control over their bodies if their tails are grabbed, but this weakness isn't as exploitable since in theory any Saiyan could just train their tail and avoid dealing with this problem. But now we can finally move on to my final conclusion after thoroughly deep diving into both Saiyans and Viltrumites is that you can't objectively say which is superior. Both excel in some areas better than others, and there's many things that were left out of each of those sections, and that's because the point was already clear and pretty much made obvious. When it came to Viltrumite survivability, they're much better than Saiyans, although the gap in terms of combat is just as large in my opinion when it comes to Saiyans being better at growing in strength and fighting overall. You'll understand a little bit more about what I'm saying in a second, just hear me out. Viltrumites are the better race when it comes to being successful in their society and building a utopia that we hear about before the Scourge virus, compared to Saiyans who are just far more about fighting and pushing themselves as their most primal entertainment. Viltrumites just aren't the same and care more about their quality of life, society, and government. The short answer is that Viltrumites care way more about getting their money up and grinding, while Saiyans just want to throw hands. They're also far better equipped for traveling through space, which is a pretty important factor if your job is conquering planets. Even just the fact that they don't need to use a Saiyan space pod makes them a whole lot better at their job. Viltrumites are a better society. They can conquer planets more effectively given the fact that they can fly through space and their lifespan. But if we're talking about combat ability, then it's not even close. The Saiyans are far more superior than Viltrumites. When it comes to who would generally be the stronger fighter, the Saiyan absolutely violates the Viltrumite. I didn't even bring up the fact that Saiyans have transformations, and it wasn't even mentioned at all because Viltrumites don't have anything that we can really compare to side by side like that, and it was honestly overkill. Every pure-blooded Saiyan is born with their tail, and when making eye contact with the full moon, they transform into a giant monkey that becomes 10 times stronger than they were before. Some Saiyans can even create these power balls that function like the moon when it comes to transforming into great apes, which means that even if there isn't a full moon, a Saiyan who knows how to create one of these power balls can still transform and instantly make themselves 10 times stronger. Every Saiyan can also use their emotions to push themselves beyond their normal limits, even to the point where they transform into something far greater than even the Great Ape. After reaching some unknown threshold where the Saiyan body has enough of something called S cells, through great emotion they can transform into golden-haired Super Saiyans. This transformation makes them 50 times greater than they were before, and later stages can even push them to being 400 times stronger than their base form. This would be like barely being able to bench 130 pounds and then quickly reaching another PR of 6,500 in Super Saiyan. There's later transformations that possibly go way beyond even 400, and by some estimates, some people even say they grow by millions and billions and trillions of times in power. And while Viltrumites do have greater endurance and generally tougher skin because smart atoms can also harden on contact, Saiyan biology lets you grow far more rapidly and honestly more easily than Viltrumite genetics. You could argue that it's unfair to include Super Saiyan or the insane Zenkai boost that they get when comparing the average Viltrumite to the average Saiyan, since no Saiyan in history has ever even had a power level of 60,000, but things like the Great Ape, Zenkai boosts, and the insane fighting gains that they receive just by engaging in combat make it far more obvious that Saiyans as fighters would be generally superior compared to Viltrumites. Even Raditz could fire a Ki Blast, which makes things even more complicated for Viltrumites because they have no way of combating anybody beyond close range without flying towards them, but including Ki as one of those factors I always thought was kind of unfair, so I'll let you guys decide down below. Viltrumites are the better utopia, society, and have all the qualities that are important for making sure your entire race doesn't become enslaved to a short racist space alien like Frieza, but Saiyans are the better fighters overall and don't have literal weaknesses that would have Goku slapping any Viltrumite like Frieza on Namek completely cooked. Their rate of growth is just far more better and their transformations make this one-sided. Viltrumites are the far better society, but Saiyans are the stronger opponents. Make sure you go check out Goku vs Omni-Man if you haven't, and make sure you guys drink plenty of juice.